So, if anyone ever asks you a question, the answer is always standards. So my name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO, the National Information Standards Organization. I'm one of the, NISO is one of the many standards bodies engaged in standards activities that you'll hear about today. NISO is a member of the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, and we represent the interests of the information and documentation communities. So those are publishers, libraries. And ANSI has this fantastic series of cartoons and even some videos about standards. There's a fantastic one of Santa Claus on a sled for the holidays, and all of the snow safety transportation standards as Santa is pushing his sled down a hill and then gets caught in the snow. It's fantastic. But standards are literally everywhere. Everywhere you look around, every building you're in, every electronic device that you use, every piece of content that you interact with is standardized in some fashion. And these are just some examples of, this is again, ANSI's student image focused on electronic devices. And it highlights just some of the standards that are related in the electronic devices that you have and hold in your hands. Everything from digital displays, high definition, the computers, the graphics themselves, the file formats of music, file formats, audio file, content file form structures, the software, the programming languages, the cybersecurity, the authentication systems, all of these are all standardized. The batteries, the screws that hold the thing together. And in our world, standards are very familiar, even if we don't think about them. Buried deep inside of every book are a suite of standards that have developed over centuries. Everything from page sizes, indexes, citations, the binding, the paper. All of these things have, over time, developed. And as we've moved from a print world into an electronic world, many of the things that had been standardized years ago and we didn't give much thought to have had to been reconsidered and redeveloped. Page numbers, for example. Page numbers developed as a way in which the production staff could put together and bind together folios and pages, because Johann over here wasn't as quick at laying in type as Peter is over here, and you had stacks of paper that you needed to bind together, and they noted on the page numbers so that the people could identify which was the appropriate order, had you folded the folio properly. But in a digital context, what does a page number mean when you can resize the font to 72 points so you can read it without your reading glasses? What does that page number mean? Page numbers are still very valuable things to identify content in a book. But we've had to think about what does a page mean in a digital environment. And we have in our community, and by our community I'm thinking well beyond journals and books here, a very complicated landscape of standards, of identifiers that are appropriate for different communities, are appropriate for different purposes. Focusing on things like copyright and how do you exchange copyright information, how do you exchange metadata for discovery, How do you deal with the multimedia that might be incorporated in a piece of content in a digital environment? How do all of those things get marked up? How do all of those things get identified and described in the metadata for those things? So it's a very complicated landscape, a kind of alphabet soup, if you will, of acronyms that pervade our environment. And Andrew Tenenbaum had a great comment about standards. The nice thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And that's certainly true in our environment, and it extends well beyond our own community. So speaking a little bit about community, how many of you are familiar with NISO and what we do? Fantastic. Everyone raised their hand. I love that. This is how we get through 38 slides. Our portfolio is actually quite broad and touches on a variety of issues that relate to the publishing community, the software communities, as well as the library community. So things that were developed within NISO, the MARC record format, the ISSNs, we've done work on things like paper permanence and binding. Most recently, we've been focused on the information exchange in the electronic environment, so things like the Open URL standard for identifying the appropriate copy of a piece of content, DOI, Sushi, KBART. We've done some work in licensing, CIRU, alternative metrics, privacy. We've focused most of our attention on interoperability in those places where the publishing community and the library community and the vendor community overlap and intersect. Our membership is roughly divided in thirds between those three constituent groups. We also touch into a variety of other communities like international communities, other standards development organizations, etc. And standards in our marketplace, our environment is inherently international, and we engage internationally on a variety of things. NISO itself is, despite our name, is about 20% comprised of members who are outside of the United States. And we engage a variety of players internationally. One of the things that we do, and actually Nettie and I just got back from a meeting in South Africa on the development of international standards for information and documentation. And this is the ISO Technical Committee that focuses on our space. NISO is also responsible in this regard for managing the subcommittee, the International Subcommittee on Identifiers. So this is the place within ISO where ISSN, ISBN, the International Standard Recording Code, the International Standard Audiovisual Number, all of these things are standardized. But it's also a place where other standards in our space get formalized at an international level. Things like country codes. So if you ever go to a URL outside of the United States, the top level domain .uk, .fr, .de for Germany, all of those are international country codes. That's another standard that's developed within TC46. But there are many organizations that develop standards in our community. Some of them are formal standards development organizations. Some of them are accredited by ANSI. Some of them are not accredited by ANSI, but are de jure standards organizations. So they develop sort of force of law standards. Others are less formal organizations that develop de facto standards. Organizations like the Library of Congress. Or the Research Data Alliance. They're not technically standards development organizations, but they do work in our space, and the output of what they do is very similar to a standard in many regards. And even occasionally organizations like STM, the STM Association, or the Association of American Publishers, have helped develop some of the foundational standards in our community and then have passed them on to formal standardization organizations like NISO. So organizations like Editeur in the EU focus on the development of things like ONIX for books, ONIX for journals. There's a whole suite of ONIX standards. In the book industry, there's a book industry study group that focuses on the trade issues related to book standards. So they're focused on things like BISAC and identification and a standard called THEMA. The magazine industry similarly is tied into their community. And they do things like file formats for the magazine industry and the PRISM standard. The W3C is an important organization involved in the development of web standards. And as increasingly increasingly content is published by our community onto the web, the importance of HTML5 and CSS has just increased, and we'll hear quite a bit more about the work of W3C as we go through the program. And within our two communities, within the library community and the publishing community, we have different workflows. The workflow for creating content has a variety of elements where standards are inserted in the process of creating content, identifying authors, the review process, practices for formatting documents, and the publication process of file formats. That moves into the distribution and the assessment areas of publication. And then in the library community, once content moves out of the publishing community, you also get into the suite of content standards related to the library that deal with acquisitions, with providing access, how content is administered, how support is provided, and how evaluation is taking place. And oftentimes there's a relationship there between the acquisition standards in how a library would acquire content and how they have to interact with a publisher. And so demand-driven acquisitions and things along those lines. Similarly with assessment, how the publishing community is providing details on the use of content are also standardized through things like Counter and Sushi. So very quickly, I'm at a very high level going to touch on some of the standards that we'll hear more about, or some things that I think are worth catching your eye on. And again, this is just an introduction, so a few of these things we'll dig into a little bit more detail in the program. So starting with file creation, I think one of the most interesting developments in the last several years have to do with EPUB. And Bill will touch in much more detail about this. But I think increasingly having a packaging format that's focused on HTML that can capture the display of an article, package that up, and be able to communicate that in a way that can be rendered on reading devices is critically important. Anyone who's tried to read a PDF on an iPhone will understand the value of EPUB. And recently, EPUB and the International Digital Publishing Forum, IDPF, has kind of rolled itself up into the W3C, which I think provides a lot of opportunity for our community, for the publishing community, to engage directly with the technology providers who are deeply embedded in some of these issues, and pushing out some of the publishing expertise into the technology community to ensure that the content that we're creating is rendered properly on the web and on devices that use the web as a format, as an underlying structure for content delivery. NISO's also done a lot of work recently in the family of XML standards or tagging standards that really began with the National Library of Medicine's DTD. It was brought into NISO maybe about 5 years ago and formalized as JATS, NISO JATS. NISO has also done a lot of work with this community to extend this suite of standards into things like standards publication. So an XML standard for standards. We're also looking at extending this into books with a project that NLM has been working on called BITS, which is a derivative of this tagging structure. There's also a lot going on in the world of identification. We have our favorite ISBN number, International Standard Book Number. This is just about ready to be published as a revision. And there's going to be a lot of changes in this new standard that focus on the identification, particularly of ebooks, and the assignment of ISBN numbers for ebooks. Another really important initiative regarding identification that's had a lot of success in our community has been Orchid and the identification of individuals. I think Orchid is somewhere north of 2.5 million IDs registered so far, which is just amazing. And a number of the publishers are using this and incorporating it into their publication process, which I think is going to solve a vast number of issues that are facing our community when it comes to disambiguation of authors and kind of linking together the content which we're distributing. Another project we'll talk a little bit more detail about is the presentation and identification of e-journals. This is increasingly problematic, especially in the session this morning. We talked about predators and predatory journals. How do you know that this is the appropriate journal that you're publishing in, or how do you discover that that you desire to publish in, or how do you discover that, especially as titles change over time? Another big issue in our community, is kind of a lingering problem, is the identification of institutions. And how do you identify Johns Hopkins University and its 17 different iterations? You've got the Applied Physics Lab, you've got the medical institution. What are you selling to? How do you identify those things? How does a grant funder know that they're having success with working with a particular institution? All of these things, authentication systems, they all tie around who is the subscriber, who is the institution that we're working with. This is a really challenging problem. Another organization focusing on identification that's kind of addressing some of the real problems in our space right now has to do with the publication of research data. So DataCite is making some really interesting inroads in terms of the identification of data and incorporating data into the publication process. Another area of focus for NISO is the area of discovery and interoperability. So the Knowledge Bases and Related Tools project, and there's been several developments around KBART, not just the file structure itself, but how do you exchange that information? One of the other big issues, again, it came out in the session this morning, has to deal with discovery. And how do you deal with the issues and challenges around discovery and discovery systems and index discovery systems, and ensuring the fair and equitable distribution of content to discovery systems. And then finally, with regard to systems interoperability, we have the RA21 project. Again, this is something we'll talk in a little bit more detail later in the program. This is a joint project between NISO and STM to focus on issues related to the access control systems and moving us away from a strictly IP-based environment. Try to move something that's much more secure. And then we don't want to forget about some of the important work done in preservation, so premise. And then also some work done by the Government Printing Office on how do you ensure that work that is being distributed is actually authenticated in some fashion. So how do you ensure that no one has changed or adjusted the press releases coming out from the Trump administration? And then as we wrap all of this up into the areas of assessment, this is something that NISA has been working on since the 1950s. We recently just finished some work related to new forms of assessment, so alternative metrics, and how do we define and build trust into the community of alternative metrics. Another area that we've been working on, again, there's I think 6,000 or 7,000 different citation formats. And NISO has a standard that we're just launched a revision of that is focused on not necessarily formatting standards, but what are the components that go into citations. I think that what we kind of wrap this all together is that science and communicating scientific information really isn't what it used to be. This is a 16th century manuscript from the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And this is a computer visualization of some atmospheric research. Think about how much things have changed in terms of digital content distribution, and how much our systems need to change to maintain interactivity with that. So the standards that we are creating have to keep up, and the publishers who are distributing content need to keep up with those standards in order to ensure that the content that they're creating and distributing is usefully accessible. Then I'm going to end with a quote from Charles Mingus, jazz musician, who said that making the simple complicated is commonplace, but making the complicated simple, awesomely simple, and that's creativity. And I like to think that the work that NISO and some of the other standards organizations in our community are really trying to take very complicated things and simplify them in a way that we can all apply them, we can all use them. So with that, thank you. Any questions before we dive in?